Felix freezes after discovering Hyunjin's mysterious gift for someone else, forcing both of them to face hidden feelings and painful misunderstandings. The neatly wrapped box slipped from Hyunjin's hands and landed at Felix's feet with a dull thud, revealing a silver bracelet nestled inside black velvet before Hyunjin could stop him. Felix stared at it as if the room had suddenly become too small to breathe in. His fingers trembled while picking up the bracelet, the cool metal reflecting the soft light from the apartment window. The elegant design was unmistakably expensive, carefully chosen rather than bought on impulse. A tiny engraved star rested beside a crescent moon, the exact style Hyunjin always said represented people he wanted to protect forever. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Felix's voice finally broke through the suffocating silence. "You bought it." For him, the words barely escaped his lips, carrying more pain than accusation. Hyunjin instinctively reached for the box. "Felix." But Felix stepped back. His heartbeat pounded so loudly that every other sound disappeared. Even the gentle rain tapping against the windows seemed distant. He had promised himself countless times that he would never assume the worst, never let insecurity destroy what they had built together. Yet the bracelet refused to let him believe otherwise. Weeks. Hyunjin had disappeared almost every evening for weeks. He answered messages later than usual. He smiled at his phone when he thought nobody was looking. He hid shopping bags before entering the apartment. Felix had ignored every strange detail, convincing himself that trust meant resisting suspicion. Now all those scattered memories assembled into one cruel picture. "So it was true," Felix whispered. Hyunjin frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You've been avoiding me." "Haven't." "You stopped telling me where you go." "Just been busy." Felix laughed softly, though no amusement reached his eyes. "Busy buying gifts for someone else." Hyunjin opened his mouth but closed it again. The silence became its own answer. Felix lowered his head. His greatest fear had never been betrayal itself. It was becoming someone who could be replaced without noticing. Ever since childhood, people had left quietly, friends moved away, promises faded, smiles disappeared, no dramatic endings. Only empty spaces where warmth once existed. Hyunjin had become the first person who made those empty spaces feel full again, which was exactly why losing him terrified Felix more than he could admit. He carefully placed the bracelet back inside the box. "You don't have to explain." "I do." "No." Felix forced a smile so fragile it looked painful. "If it's important enough to hide from me," he swallowed, "then maybe I wasn't supposed to know." Hyunjin stepped closer. "It isn't like that." "Then what is it like?" Again, silence. Hyunjin looked genuinely conflicted. His hands clenched into fists before relaxing again. He seemed trapped between two impossible choices. Felix noticed something then. Not guilt, fear. It flashed across Hyunjin's face only briefly before disappearing beneath forced calm. That frightened Felix even more, because Hyunjin wasn't a good liar if he looked afraid. Then whatever truth he was hiding must have been enormous. Hyunjin finally spoke. "Just need a little more time." Felix slowly shook his head. "Time is what people ask for before they leave." Hyunjin immediately answered. "Not leaving." "You can't promise that." "I already did." Felix looked directly into his eyes. "Then why can't you tell me who the bracelet is for?" The question lingered between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky. Hyunjin inhaled deeply. "I can't." Those two words shattered something invisible inside Felix, not because Hyunjin had chosen someone else, but because he had chosen silence. Felix nodded once, very slowly. "I understand." Hyunjin instantly realized he didn't. Felix wasn't angry anymore. He was disappointed. That quiet disappointment frightened Hyunjin far more than shouting ever could. Felix picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'm going for a walk. It's raining." "I know. You'll get sick." Felix smiled faintly. "I don't think that's what hurts the most right now." Before Hyunjin could stop him, Felix opened the apartment door. Cold wind rushed inside. Rain filled the hallway with its fresh scent. The door closed gently behind him. No slam, no dramatic goodbye, just quiet footsteps fading into the storm. Hyunjin remained frozen in the middle of the room. His eyes drifted back toward the gift box. His fingers tightened around it until the edges pressed painfully into his skin. He whispered to himself, almost as though confessing to the empty apartment. "If only you knew why." Rain soaked Felix long before he realized he had wandered far from the apartment, but he welcomed the cold because it dulled the ache growing heavier inside his chest. The city glowed beneath blurred streetlights, their reflections stretching across the wet pavement like broken memories. Cars rushed past, splashing water against the curb. yet Felix barely noticed. His mind replayed the same moment over and over, the silver bracelet resting inside the velvet box and Hyunjin's quiet admission. "I can't." Those words echoed louder than the thunder above. Felix slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and kept walking without a destination. Whenever life became too overwhelming, he walked until the noise inside his head matched the rhythm of his footsteps. It had become a habit years ago, one he never told anyone about. He stopped in front of a small convenience store, its warm lights spilling onto the empty sidewalk. Through the glass, he could see couples laughing over instant noodles, a father helping his daughter choose candy, and an elderly cashier humming softly while arranging shelves. For a brief moment, Felix envied strangers. Their happiness seemed so uncomplicated. His phone vibrated. Hyunjin. He stared at the screen until the call ended. A second later, another message appeared. "Please answer." Then another. "You're misunderstanding everything." Felix closed the notification without replying. If there was an explanation, why hadn't Hyunjin given it when it mattered? Meanwhile, Hyunjin remained alone in the apartment, unable to take his eyes off the unopened gift box. He lowered himself onto the couch and rubbed both hands over his face. "I ruined everything." His voice disappeared into the empty room. He reached for his phone again, only to stop before pressing the call button. He wanted to tell Felix the truth, every single word. But making that promise weeks earlier had left him trapped. A promise was still a promise, even when it hurt someone you loved. His thoughts drifted back to the afternoon that had started everything. Someone had asked him for help, not for money, not for advice, but for silence. "Don't tell Felix yet," the person had pleaded. "I want it to be a surprise." Hyunjin had agreed without realizing how much that secret would cost. Now the distance between him and Felix felt wider than any road. Across town, Felix eventually found himself standing beside the quiet river that cut through the city. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. He leaned against the railing, watching ripples spread across the dark water. Running away won't solve anything. Familiar voice startled him. Felix turned. Changbin stood a few steps away, holding a black umbrella. "What are you doing here?" Felix asked. "I could ask you the same thing." Felix forced a smile. "It was just a walk." Changbin looked unconvinced. "Been walking for almost 2 hours." Felix blinked. "Been following me?" "Been looking for you," Felix sighed. "Hyunjin call you?" Changbin hesitated. "Yes," Felix nodded as though he had expected that answer. "I don't want to talk about it." Changbin stepped beside him, resting his elbows on the railing. "You know Hyunjin." "I thought I did." "Wouldn't hurt you on purpose." Felix laughed quietly. Intentions don't erase pain. Changbin couldn't argue with that. The silence stretched between them until Felix finally spoke again. "Tell me honestly." Changbin looked at him. "Has there been someone else?" Changbin answered almost immediately. "No." Felix searched his face. "You didn't even hesitate." "Because I know Hyunjin." "Then why is he hiding things?" Changbin lowered his gaze toward the river. "I can't answer that." Felix's shoulders slumped. "So everyone knows except me." "It isn't like that." "Feels exactly like that." Changbin wanted to explain more than anything, but he had also given his word, another promise, another silence. Felix smiled bitterly. Guess secrets spread faster than trust. At that exact moment, Hyunjin arrived at the riverside after searching nearly every street nearby. The moment he saw Felix standing beneath the gray sky, relief flooded across his face. Turned slowly. Their eyes met across the quiet walkway. Hyunjin took one cautious step forward. "Been looking everywhere for you." Felix remained still. "So you found me?" "I was worried." "You should have been honest instead." Hyunjin stopped walking, his voice softened. "I know." Felix looked exhausted rather than angry. "I don't need perfect answers anymore." Hyunjin's heart sank. "Just need to know whether I still matter." The first time that night, Hyunjin's eyes filled with tears. "You matter more than you could ever imagine." Felix wanted to believe him. He truly did. But after so many unanswered questions, trust had become harder to hold than heartbreak itself. Morning arrived quietly, but neither Felix nor Hyunjin had slept. A pale golden light filtered through the clouds, painting the city in soft colors that felt strangely out of place after the previous night's storm. The streets were alive again, yet everything inside Hyunjin's apartment remained painfully still. Hyunjin stood in the kitchen, staring at 2 untouched mugs of coffee. Out of habit, he had prepared one exactly the way Felix liked it, warm milk, a little extra sugar, and a sprinkle of cinnamon. The familiar aroma filled the room, but it only reminded him that Felix wasn't there. He reached for his phone once more. No new messages, no missed calls. He lowered it onto the counter with a quiet sigh. Never been this afraid, he whispered to himself, not afraid of losing an argument. Not afraid of being misunderstood, afraid that the person who had become his safest place would no longer believe in him. Across the city, Felix sat alone on a bench in a small park. Children laughed nearby as they chased pigeons across the grass, their carefree voices carried by the morning breeze. He watched them without really seeing them. His thoughts kept returning to Hyunjin's expression by the river. There had been no arrogance, no indifference, only fear. It was the same fear Felix had seen in the apartment before he walked away. If he was lying, Felix murmured, why did he look so heartbroken? The question refused to leave him. His phone vibrated. This time it wasn't Hyunjin. It was Jeongin. Can we meet? There's something you should know, Felix frowned. A few hours later, they met in a quiet cafe tucked away from the busy streets. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sweetness of warm pastries, creating an atmosphere that should have felt comforting. Instead, Felix's chest tightened as Jeongin sat across from him, unusually serious. You look tired, Jeongin said gently. I didn't sleep. I figured. For a moment, neither of them spoke, then Jeongin folded his hands together. Hyunjin called me last night. Felix looked away. I guessed he would. Wasn't asking me to convince you. Felix remained silent. He was asking if I'd seen you. He sounded terrified. Felix swallowed. Never heard him like that before. Jeongin hesitated, carefully choosing his words. I can't tell you everything. Felix let out a tired laugh. Apparently no one can. Sorry, I know, Jeongin leaned forward. But I can tell you one thing. Felix finally met his eyes. Gift isn't what you think it is. Felix's heartbeat quickened. So it wasn't for someone else? Jeongin smiled sadly. I didn't say that. Hope that had begun to grow inside Felix immediately faltered. Then what are you saying? Saying that sometimes the truth sounds unbelievable until every piece is revealed. Felix looked down at his cup. I don't know how much longer I can wait. Jeongin nodded. I understand. He reached into his bag and carefully placed a small sealed envelope on the table. Hyunjin asked me to keep this. Felix stared at it. He told me not to give it to you unless I believed there was no other choice. His fingers instinctively reached toward the envelope before stopping. What's inside? I don't know. You never opened it. Jeongin shook his head. It wasn't mine. Felix gently picked it up. His name was written across the front in Hyunjin's familiar handwriting, nothing else. His hands trembled. He slowly broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Before he could unfold it completely, a small photograph slipped onto the table. Felix froze. It was an old picture. One he had completely forgotten existed. It showed him and Hyunjin years earlier, standing beneath a sky filled with fireworks. Both of them were laughing, unaware the picture had even been taken. On the back, in Hyunjin's handwriting, were just a few words. The day I decided that your smile would always matter to me. Felix's vision blurred. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the letter. The first line stole the air from his lungs. If you're reading this, then I've already failed to protect the surprise I wanted to give you.
Felix read the first sentence again, then a third time. His fingers tightened around the letter as though he feared the words might disappear if he loosened his grip. The cafe around him faded into a distant blur. The clinking of cups, the soft conversations, even the music playing overhead became little more than muffled echoes. He continued reading. I know you're probably hurt. I know you'll think I've been hiding something from you. The truth is, I have, but never because I wanted to push you away. A tear landed on the page, slightly smudging the ink. Hyunjin's handwriting remained steady. Do you remember the night of the fireworks? You laughed because I insisted that every beautiful memory deserved something to hold on to. You told me memories were enough. I disagreed. Felix's breathing grew uneven. He remembered they had been younger, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a sky painted with bursts of red and gold. Hyunjin had spent nearly an hour trying to take the perfect picture while Felix kept laughing at his determination. It had become one of Felix's favorite memories. He simply hadn't realized Hyunjin treasured it just as deeply. The letter continued. I've spent months searching for something worthy of that promise. Not because expensive things matter, but because I wanted to give you something that would remind you that no matter where life takes us, you'll always have someone who chose you. Felix slowly looked up. His eyes met Jeongin's. The bracelet. Jeongin nodded quietly. Felix lowered his gaze back to the page. The bracelet wasn't meant for someone else. His heart skipped. It was always yours. For several seconds, Felix couldn't move. He remembered every assumption he had made, every accusation, every moment he had interpreted through the lens of fear instead of trust. But then he reached the next paragraph. I couldn't tell you because someone close to us was helping me prepare everything. They asked me to keep it secret until the day I planned to give it to you. I promised I wouldn't ruin the surprise. Felix closed his eyes. The promise, that was the promise Hyunjin had been protecting, not another relationship, not another person, just a surprise that had slowly become a misunderstanding. Felix whispered, his voice cracked. I was wrong. Hyunjin offered a gentle smile. You weren't wrong for being hurt. Felix shook his head, but I never gave him a chance. He folded the letter carefully, treating it as though it was something fragile enough to break with one careless movement. At that very moment, the bell above the cafe door chimed. Felix instinctively looked toward the entrance. Hyunjin stood there. His hair was slightly damp from the light rain outside, and dark circles rested beneath his eyes. It was obvious he hadn't slept. When their eyes met, neither of them spoke. Hyunjin took a cautious step forward. I wasn't sure you'd still want to see me. Felix stood slowly, still holding the letter. I read it. Hyunjin's shoulders tensed. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. Felix walked closer until only a few steps separated them. I should have trusted you. Hyunjin shook his head immediately. I should have realized keeping the surprise wasn't worth hurting you. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. No anger remained, only exhaustion, only regret. Felix let out a quiet laugh through his tears. You really chose the worst possible way to keep a surprise. A faint smile finally appeared on Hyunjin's face. I know, you're terrible at hiding secrets. Learn that. Felix smiled for the first time in days. So have I. Without another word, Hyunjin reached into his coat pocket and carefully took out the small velvet box. He opened it. The silver bracelet shimmered beneath the cafe lights, the tiny crescent moon and star reflecting softly. This was always meant to find its way back to you, Hyunjin said quietly. Felix looked at the bracelet, then back at Hyunjin. This time there was no doubt in his eyes, only understanding. Slowly he extended his wrist. Hyunjin fastened the bracelet carefully, his hands trembling just enough to reveal how much this moment meant to him. When the clasp clicked into place, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Some apologies were stronger when spoken through actions rather than words. Felix gently touched the bracelet and smiled. It's beautiful. Hyunjin smiled back, relief finally softening the tension that had weighed on him for days. It always belonged to you. The afternoon sun filtered through the cafe windows, casting warm streaks of light across the silver bracelet now resting on Felix's wrist. Every slight movement caught the light, sending tiny reflections dancing across the wooden table. Felix couldn't stop looking at it, not because of its price. Not because of its elegant design, but because he finally understood what it represented. It wasn't a gift meant to impress, it was a promise that had survived misunderstanding. Hyunjin watched him quietly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. I kept imagining this moment, he admitted with a small smile. Just not like this. Felix let out a soft laugh. I imagined it too. Hyunjin raised an eyebrow. You did. I imagined finding out you were hiding something. Smile faded from both of their faces. I just never imagined I'd let my fears write the ending before I knew the whole story. Hyunjin lowered his gaze. I should have trusted that we could protect the surprise together. Felix reached across the table, gently placing his hand over Hyunjin's. We both made mistakes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt heavy, it felt peaceful. Outside, the rain clouds had finally disappeared, leaving behind a bright blue sky that seemed almost symbolic. Hyunjin chuckled softly. You know what's ironic? What? The bracelet wasn't even supposed to be the main gift. Felix blinked. It wasn't. Hyunjin shook his head. It was only the beginning. Felix laughed in disbelief. Tell me the rest doesn't involve another secret. Hyunjin replied immediately. I've learned my lesson. They both smiled. Hyunjin reached into his bag and carefully pulled out a worn notebook. Its corners were slightly bent and the cover showed signs of being carried around for years. Felix looked at it curiously. What's that? Hyunjin placed it gently on the table. My favorite possession. Felix frowned. Never seen it before. I know. He opened the notebook carefully. Inside were photographs, ticket stubs, handwritten notes, pressed flowers, tiny sketches, and little memories collected over the years. Every page held a moment they had shared, the first movie they watched together, the cafe where they laughed until closing time, a receipt from the tiny bakery where Felix accidentally ordered enough bread for 6 people, even a napkin with a doodle Felix had absent-mindedly drawn years earlier. You kept all of this, Felix whispered. Hyunjin nodded. I didn't want to forget anything. Felix slowly turned another page. There in neat handwriting was a sentence that made his eyes sting with tears. The happiest days are usually the quiet ones. Felix closed the notebook for a moment, unable to speak. You remembered things I forgot. Remembered because they mattered. Felix smiled through damp eyes. So, what was the real gift? Hyunjin looked at him warmly. This. He gently pushed the notebook toward Felix. I wanted you to have every memory we've built together. Felix stared at the notebook in stunned silence. This is yours. It was. Hyunjin smiled. Now it's ours. Felix held the notebook carefully against his chest. No expensive present could ever compare. No hidden surprise could ever carry more meaning. It wasn't a collection of paper and photographs. It was proof that someone had quietly treasured every ordinary moment they had shared. As they left the cafe together, the city seemed brighter than it had in days. People hurried along the sidewalks, bicycles rolled past, and a cool breeze carried the scent of flowers from a nearby park. For the first time in what felt like forever, Felix wasn't thinking about what could be lost. He was thinking about everything they still had. He glanced down at the bracelet one last time before smiling at Hyunjin. Next time you plan something special. Hyunjin laughed. Tell you. Felix shook his head with a grin. No, Hyunjin looked surprised. Help you keep the secret. They continued walking side by side beneath the clear afternoon sky, their hands finding each other naturally. Neither of them spoke again for a while. They didn't need to. Some stories didn't become unforgettable because of grand gestures or dramatic endings. Sometimes they became unforgettable because two people chose to trust each other again, carrying every shared memory forward, one quiet step at a time. Several weeks passed, and life slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm neither Felix nor Hyunjin had realized they had been missing. The silver bracelet rarely left Felix's wrist. Every morning before leaving home, he would unconsciously brush his thumb over the tiny crescent moon and star engraved on its surface. It had become more than a gift. It reminded him that trust was not built through perfect moments, but through choosing each other after imperfect ones. Hyunjin noticed the habit but never mentioned it. Instead, he smiled quietly each time he saw it. One cool autumn evening they found themselves returning to the riverside where everything had nearly fallen apart. The water reflected thousands of golden lights from the city skyline, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves. The same railing where Felix had once stood alone now felt strangely different. It looks smaller, Felix said. Hyunjin laughed softly. River, the fear. Hyunjin turned to him. What do you mean? Felix rested his hands on the railing. When I stood here that night I thought losing you was inevitable. He smiled faintly. I didn't realize I was really afraid of losing my ability to trust. Hyunjin remained silent, allowing Felix to continue. I used to believe that love disappeared the moment people stopped explaining themselves. He looked at Hyunjin. Now I think love is also shown by the effort to understand before judging. Hyunjin felt his chest tighten. I still wish I had handled everything differently. Felix nodded. So do I. For a moment they listened to the quiet sound of water flowing beneath the bridge. Been thinking, Hyunjin said. Dangerous, Felix teased. Hyunjin laughed. It usually is. He reached into his coat pocket. Felix immediately raised an eyebrow. Another secret. No, Hyunjin smiled. This time no secrets. He unfolded a small piece of paper. Been writing something. Felix accepted it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Some people remember birthdays, some people remember anniversaries. I remember ordinary Tuesdays, random conversations, forgotten smiles and rainy evenings, because those were the moments I realized happiness wasn't something extraordinary. It was simply you being there. Felix looked up, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. You wrote this, Hyunjin nodded. I wanted you to know something. What? No matter how busy life becomes. Gently took Felix's hand. I'll never let silence speak louder than my heart again. Felix smiled. And I'll never let fear answer questions I haven't asked. Two of them stood quietly as the city lights shimmered across the river. There were no dramatic confessions, no grand promises shouted beneath the night sky. Only two people who had learned that relationships were not protected by perfection, but by honesty, patience, and the courage to speak before misunderstandings had the chance to grow. The wind drifted gently across the water, and Felix instinctively leaned a little closer. Hyunjin smiled without looking away from the river. You know, I'm glad you opened that letter. Felix chuckled. I'm glad you wrote it. Neither of them noticed the first stars beginning to appear above the city. They simply remained there side by side, grateful that what had once seemed like the end had quietly become the beginning of a stronger chapter in their lives. Winter arrived gently, wrapping the city in crisp air and quiet mornings. The streets glittered beneath strings of white lights, cafes filled with the comforting aroma of cinnamon and roasted coffee, and familiar songs drifted through every corner as people hurried to prepare for the holidays. Felix stood by the apartment window, watching tiny snowflakes settle on the balcony railing. The silver bracelet caught the pale sunlight as he folded his arms, its familiar weight now feeling as natural as his own heartbeat. Behind him, Hyunjin was trying and failing to wrap a small package. The paper had been folded unevenly 3 times already. Felix smiled without turning around. You know I can hear you struggling. I'm not struggling, Hyunjin protested. A second later, the unmistakable sound of tearing paper filled the room. Okay, maybe a little. Felix laughed, the warm sound echoing through the apartment. It was a laugh Hyunjin had missed more than he could ever explain. You should let me do it. Hyunjin looked up with mock determination. Have something to prove, that you can defeat wrapping paper, exactly. Felix walked over and sat beside him on the floor. For a few moments they simply worked together in comfortable silence, occasionally laughing whenever the tape refused to cooperate. It was ordinary, wonderfully ordinary. Months earlier, silence between them had carried fear, now it carried peace. Hyunjin glanced sideways. Can I ask you something? Felix nodded. When you found the bracelet, he paused. Were you really ready to walk away? Felix stopped smoothing the wrapping paper. He thought carefully before answering. I wasn't ready to leave you. Hyunjin looked at him. I was ready to protect myself. Honesty lingered between them. I'd spent so much of my life believing that people eventually chose someone else. Felix looked down at the bracelet, so when I saw it, every old fear came rushing back. Hyunjin reached for his hand. I'm sorry those fears ever had a reason to exist. Felix squeezed his fingers gently. Quieter now, because of me, because of us. Hyunjin smiled. That's my favorite answer. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the city in white. Inside, the apartment felt warmer than ever. Later that evening, they decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. Children built snowmen in a nearby park while families admired the holiday lights decorating the streets. Felix suddenly stopped in front of a small jewelry store. Hyunjin noticed immediately. What is it? Felix looked through the display window. I remember standing here months ago. Almost came inside. Why? Felix smiled sheepishly. I wanted to buy you something. Hyunjin blinked. You never told me that. Changed my mind. Why? Felix laughed softly. I couldn't decide. Hyunjin looked at him with playful suspicion. So you've been keeping secrets too? Felix grinned. Only tiny ones. Hyunjin nudged his shoulder. No more secrets. More secrets. They continued walking until they reached the small bridge overlooking the river. The water moved quietly beneath a thin layer of mist, reflecting the colorful lights hanging from the trees. Felix rested his hands on the railing. Funny. What? I used to think this bridge would always remind me of heartbreak. Hyunjin stood beside him, and now, Felix looked toward the city skyline before turning back with a gentle smile. Now it reminds me that misunderstandings don't have to become endings. Hyunjin slipped his hand into Felix's. I'm glad we stayed. Felix nodded. So am I. The snow continued to fall around them, soft and unhurried, covering old footprints until the path ahead looked completely new. And together, they walked forward without looking back, carrying not the weight of the misunderstanding that had almost separated them, but the quiet certainty that every day ahead was another chance to choose each other again.